May your experience lead you to victory. The match will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully we got lots of familiar faces again tonight. I want to start this evening with a scenario. Imagine you've all used your elite skills and you finally returned a shell on your target machine. Maybe that's an awesome feeling. You've had to celebrate with a little fist pump, maybe a little wiggle in your chair, maybe an exhaustive yes as you finally made it. And in the context of Hack the Box, you can get that juicy flag now and see those points increase, watch your name climb up the ladder board, maybe brag a little to your friends. So we CD, change directory into the users folder and see permission denied. Spalderdash, rats, gosh darn it, snap. Well, not to worry, because today we'll be covering the basic techniques in a Linux environment so that we can actually get the correct privileges. Before we get into the topic for this evening, I just want to bring up some awesome news and events. Firstly, a massive congratulations to the first Pay It Forward OSCP recipient, Hustle Bunny. If this is the first time you're hearing about this, then where have you been? It's actually a fantastic initiative started by Monks that is looking to give away PWK vouchers to worthy candidates. There are 9 remaining now, so if you think that is you, then check out the Pay It Forward blog on hacksouth.africa or just ask staff mod in the Discord. Just next, there's Atomic Nikos on the crew over at Digital Overdose. They're hosting their second CTF this weekend. Prizes are going to be sponsored by Hack the Box and some others, and there will be beginner-friendly challenges. If you are keen, RSVP on the Hack South events channel, and we can divide those players into teams and then create private channels for the competition. Okay, so back to the scenario. What is privilege escalation? Well, privilege escalation is very much in the name. The idea behind this is you take your current level of access and privileges and escalate them to a higher level so that you have more accesses and privilege. This will mean that you're able to change directories into that user folder that originally you couldn't read the user flag in. It's very common though in Hack the Box to have to privs twice to become root. From your initial foothold in the context of WW data to a user on the target to finally root privileges. Root is considered the finish line on most Hack the Box machines as you have the highest elevated privileges now. Ultimately, the end goal of privilege escalation is to become the root user and have full control of the target machine. So there are 2 main types of privilege escalation, and let's quickly explain these and brush up on a bit of the vocabulary behind them. The concept of horizontal privilege escalation is that you remain on the same privilege level as the current user. An example would be an account takeover of a user with similar privileges, and these are typically low-level accounts with less security controls in place. You're probably wondering why bother with horizontal privilege escalation then, and that's a good question. With each new horizontal access we achieve, we might be able to read different sets of data or have different functionality that can be abused for further privilege escalation. The greater our attack surface is through multiple low-level accounts, the broader our chances of vertical escalation is. This leads me nicely to vertical escalation. This privilege escalation is when we can obtain a higher level of access than our current compromised accounts. This is typically an administrator account or root. However, this can also be any user that has elevated rights from our current user. This is the most important escalation type, as with higher level privileges, we're able to perform system level changes, such as install what we want, clear the logs, execute any arbitrary code as root, or simply just know that the machine is now fully ours. Great, so I'm hoping we understand the concept of privilege escalation. So let's talk about some of the technique that is used. I'll be sharing a Linux cheat sheet for what I'm covering today, so don't worry about the commands as I'll provide them to you after the meetup. I'll briefly cover what's needed so that we know what to look for and what to exploit or how to abuse the privilege escalation methods. There are many great online resources about how the privilege escalation techniques work. However, most people struggle to find what needs to be abused. So with that sort of out the way, let's cover some of the common priv techniques that you can look out for on the target system. Kernel exploits, they still exist for many of the Linux versions and can be easily abused to obtain root privileges. Kernel exploits are still common, as companies struggle to patch because of compatibility issues with other applications or even lack of inventory management, even laziness from system admins. There are still many reasons and they do still exist. And to execute kernel exploits is often as simple as compiling the exploit code and executing it on the target machine. It is worth noting that kernel exploits can cause stability issues, so you've got to be a little bit cautious when using them, especially on a production environment. So just bear that in mind. To check the kernel version, the best way is just to run uname tac a. However, I've included alternatives in the cheat sheet. So once you have the kernel version, a simple Google for the kernel version with the term exploit or privesc should actually return results if something exists for that version. Running services. Running services are occasionally flawed in a way that can be abused for privilege escalation. An example of a service is the Windows Manager screen on Linux. Version 4.5, which suffers from a privilege escalation exploit, or even sometimes the MySQL service could be running as root without a password, and that can also be abused to obtain root. Environment and variables, they are worth checking. The environment variables sometimes can store passwords or interesting information or even API keys, so it's definitely something that you should at least have a look at. Schedule tasks, your cron job is the job schedule on Linux and can occasionally be abused for local privilege escalation. It's worth looking at files that may be running on a scheduler like a backup. If the backup script is editable by you, you'll be able to append a line that will execute it in the context of the other user or even sometimes root. Credential hunting and interesting files. So as you go along with your enumeration on the target machine, it's worth writing down any credentials that you find. Looking at configuration files, looking at bash history, shell scripts, backup files, databases, even actually just a text file that you find lying around. These credentials may come in handy later, with a password reuse. A very common password is the MySQL database credentials found within the WordPress configuration files. And another fantastic win is also SSH private keys, especially so for other users. If you're able to find these, then you can connect back to the box as this other account. So sudo privileges can be granted to an account, which will allow the account to perform certain commands in the context of root or another account. Checking the sudo permissions for the accounts, you'll often have to provide a password for that user, unless the entry has a no password in the sudoers file. Typically, if the sudo command is a Linux binary and can be abused for privilege escalation, you'll find it's on GTFO bins. GTFO bins is a curated list of Unix binaries that can be used to bypass local security restrictions in misconfigured systems. If you find yourself a member of one of these groups, these can provide quick wins to either root or to interesting files. So Docker, you can mount the root file system on the host machine in a Docker instance. And similar to Docker is LXD or LXC, where we're able to create an LXD container where we mount the host file system again. Disk, the privilege is almost equivalent to root access, as you can access all the data inside of the machine. And lastly is ADM. Members of this group, you're able to read log files. This group won't directly grant you root access like the others, but you could leverage it to get sensitive information, stored in log files. SUIDs, the set user ID permission, can allow a user to execute a program or script with the permissions of another user, typically with elevated privileges. This low-hanging fruit binary can also be found on GTFO bins, such as the normal binaries that you find that are misconfigured. Path abuse. So path in Linux is an environment variable that specifies which directories to search for executable files. This environment variable allows you to type in a command without specifying the absolute path. So for example, ls, instead of bin ls every time you want to list, you can just do ls. That's because it is within your path. Also bear in mind that the order of which your path appeared does matter. So if two binaries exist with the same name, whichever comes first in the path will execute first. Sometimes we're also able to abuse an SUID binary that does not have an absolute path. We create a malicious binary in our path with the same name, and then this will lead to that binary being called first within the path, and then instead of the legitimate binary, and then of course giving us privilege escalation. So I know that this is a lot to take in, as we've covered quite a bit, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed because these are just the basic techniques to consider whilst you look for PrivEsc on your target. So just breathe for a second because I have a solution in the term of automation. So what if I told you some smart people have put together some great scripts that will check most, if not more, of what we've actually covered, and then report back all the useful information to you. Yep, automation is super cool. So what I'll do is I'll show you what I consider the 3 most useful ones in the lab now, and we can see how the output looks in a live demo. With that, I'm actually going to end the presentation, and let's see if we can't become root.